used to think an old person's greatest fear was death. It's not. It's opening your grandchild's bedroom door and finding nothing but a blood-soaked handkerchief with his name stitched into it. No screams, no struggle. Just a cassette tape spinning on its own, playing a man's voice. I know what you buried in Idaho. If you want it to stay buried, don't call the police. And in that moment I knew the monster from the past didn't die. It just waited for me to get comfortable. And Shadow the dog, everyone thought was just a stray, was the only one willing to chase it. If you think this is just another missing child story, wait until you look into his eyes. Subscribe now to follow our gripping emotional storytelling films unlike anything you've ever heard before. The house was too quiet. Eleanor Brooks had learned to live with silence after 70 years of life, after the death of her daughter, after the car accident that left her grandson Owen without a voice, after the long winters in the Colorado hills that muffled even her own breath under blankets of snow. But this silence wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the kind that made her bones stiffen before her mind caught up, the kind that felt wrong. She lay in bed, still barely breathing. There was no soft huff of breath outside her bedroom window, no scratch of paw against the porch door, no bark, not even the low, familiar rumble that usually came when Shadow saw a deer or a raccoon pass by in the dawn light. For 6 years, the black dog had been her clock, her protector, her second shadow. He never missed a morning. Today he had. Eleanor's fingers moved clumsily to the nightstand, knocking over her reading glasses before finally grabbing hold of them. She slipped them on with shaking hands and turned toward the frosted window. Nothing. Just snow and the dark beyond it. No silhouette. No waiting ears. No glint of amber eyes. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting in familiar rebellion. The wind outside howled low, not like a storm, but like it was remembering one. She stood ignoring the pain in her hip and reached for the cardigan draped over the rocking chair Robert built for her decades ago. She always put it on before opening the front door, even in summer. Habit, age, modesty maybe. But today, it was armor. She moved toward the front door, each step deliberate, like she was trying not to wake something. Her fingers found the cold brass handle. The door opened with a creak that felt too loud in the quiet, like breaking a vow. Wind bit into her skin. But that wasn't what froze her in place. There, right on the edge of the porch, was a drag mark. A long, irregular smear across the snow. Crimson. Diluted in places like water had been poured over it, or like something had bled out slowly. Eleanor's heart didn't just stop, it dropped. She stepped outside. The snow was fresh, powdery, maybe an hour old at most. There were prints, deep, deliberate, not shadows. A man's boot-heavy tread walking straight toward the tree line. No return track. Just one direction. But Shadow's paw prints, those were there too. And blood. A wide, staggering trail like he'd been limping, resisting dragged. And something else. A smaller set of indentations. Barefoot. Eleanor knelt beside them, her hands trembling as she hovered over the marks. Toes. Tiny ones. Owen. She turned back into the house, moving faster than her joints liked. Her heart was beating so loudly now, it drowned out everything else. The hallway stretched in front of her like a tunnel. The walls echoing with photographs, Robert in uniform, her daughter Lena as a girl, Owen just 6 months ago, with his wide, solemn eyes and the little wooden whistle he never let go of. The same whistle Eleanor had carved for him when he first came to live with her. A gift. A promise. She burst into Owen's room. Empty. The bed was still rumpled blanket halfway off the mattress. The space heater buzzed quietly beside the dresser, still warm, still on. The nightlight in the corner projected dancing stars on the ceiling. But the window open. Just an inch. Just enough. Snow had drifted in, slightly collecting on the sill. The wind shifted it, carrying it across the hardwood floor like ghost footsteps. Her knees gave out for a moment, and she sat down hard on the edge of the bed. Her hands covered her mouth. Then she noticed it, a small cassette player on the nightstand. Old, outdated, beige plastic yellowed with time. She hadn't seen one in years. It was playing. She hadn't heard it until now. Hadn't noticed the soft click it made as it whirred. Her breath caught as a man's voice emerged through the crackling static. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. I know what you did in Idaho, Ellie, the voice said. Calm. Almost amused. You think because it's been 30 years it's gone. You think because no one ever found the bodies, no one ever will. But I remember. And Shadow does too. Don't call the cops. You call them, You bury the boy. Click. That was it. No signature. No threats shouted. Just a statement. Just remembrance. The machine clicked again. Stopped. Eleanor sat frozen, her fingers still hovering above the cassette. Her breath was loud in her ears now. The silence had collapsed. The storm outside wasn't in the air. It was in her chest. She stood slowly. Walked back through the house, every board creaking like it was warning her. She reached the kitchen, grabbed the phone off the wall, and punched in the sheriff's number. Then she stopped. Her finger hovered over the final digit. Her hand was trembling. Don't call the cops. You bury the boy. She hung up. And then she screamed. Not the kind of scream that pierced through walls. The kind that cracked inside. That scraped up your ribs and left your lungs burning. Her knees hit the floor and she covered her mouth again, because that scream wasn't just for Owen. It wasn't just for Shadow. It was for Idaho. It was for 1985. It was for the night she stood in a basement with blood on her shoes and a girl's arm in her hands, and a man with green eyes and a serpent tattoo told her, "Walk out now, and no one ever finds her. Stay, and you're one of us." She walked, but she never forgot, and neither had he. She was back on her feet before her mind had caught up. Moving on instinct now. A storm rising in her gut like acid. She reached for the shotgun above the fireplace, her fingers stopping halfway. No, not yet. Instead, she went to the bookshelf. Bottom shelf behind the fake copy of Little Women she'd carved hollow years ago. Inside, a rusted key, thin curved. She hadn't used it in a decade. The cellar door creaked as she opened it. Cold air wafted up. Earth, dampness, old secrets. She stepped down carefully. The cellar was as she left it. Rows of canned peaches, a faded radio, and the metal box. Long, flat, locked with that same rusted key. She opened it. Inside a folder, manila, covered in dust. The words Case 219, West Fork scribbled in a younger version of her own handwriting, and beneath it, an old photograph. 3 people herself, younger by decades. A man in his 30s, pale eyes, and snake tattoo visible on his neck, even in the black and white. And a girl, maybe 13, handcuffed, eyes bruised. She was never identified, never found. Shadow was in the corner of the picture. No collar, just watching. Eleanor touched the edge of the photo like it might bite her. She slid it into her coat pocket and closed the box. As she climbed the stairs, she paused halfway. If Owen was taken because of this, because of what I buried, then she knew what had to happen. No cops, no delays, no more pretending it never happened. She grabbed the shotgun this time, and the photograph, and Shadow's leash. She didn't need it, she knew, but maybe Owen did. She opened the door again and stepped into the cold. Eleanor Brooks locked the front door with hands that would not stop shaking. The click of the deadbolt sounded final, like a coffin lid sliding shut. Outside, the wind pressed against the old farmhouse with soft, repetitive groans. Like breath. Like a voice trying to rise from beneath the floorboards of her memory. Inside, the silence thickened. She leaned her back against the door and slid down until she was sitting on the cold wood floor. Her knees drawn to her chest, her fingers twisting into the hem of her cardigan, like a girl clinging to a childhood blanket. Her breath came in small, shallow bursts. Idaho. She hadn't let herself think of that place in years. Not since the trial fell apart. Not since the barn was burned to the ground and the girl disappeared. Not since she stood on the courthouse steps with a sealed file under her arm and a name she never spoke again. But now that name was back. Not on a piece of paper, not whispered through gossip or rumor. It came in a voice, on a cassette, inside her home. The ghost had returned not as a memory, but as a threat. And Shadow, she closed her eyes and tried to breathe. The image was still burned into her mind, the first time she saw him 7 years ago, standing in the ash and ruin of the West Fork cabin. Blood on his muzzle, one paw raised. Not snarling, not barking, just standing, still as a statue, watching her, like he knew something, like he'd been waiting. He had no collar, no tag, no owner, but there was intelligence in his eyes. Not the eager trust of a domestic dog, nor the wary cunning of a stray. Something else. Something that unnerved her, even then. She hadn't planned to take him, but when she turned away, he followed. And when she got in the car, her hands trembling after hours with the feds, the scent of fire still clinging to her hair, he jumped into the back seat and lay down without a sound. As if it had been decided long before. Shadow. She named him the next day. Not because of his color, not because of his quietness, but because he was a shadow. A reminder. A shape that clung to her heels wherever she went. Now he was gone, and Owen too. She pushed herself up from the floor and crossed the living room to the fireplace. The hearth was cold, but the ashes from last night's fire were still loose. She knelt, reaching behind the stack of logs. Her hand found the false brick, easily years of habit. She pressed, and it gave way with a soft click. The compartment opened. Inside was a flat wooden box, no bigger than a Bible. She pulled it out, sat back on her heels, and placed it on the coffee table. For a long time, she just looked at it. It had been sealed since 2017, the year she promised herself never to open it again, the year she buried Lena, the year Owen came to live with her, voiceless and broken. She opened the box. Inside were folders, tattered manila cornered with years, notes, testimonies, Polaroids, all from the West Fork case. She spread them across the table like cards from a cursed deck. Missing girls, 15, all between the ages of 12 and 16. All vanished within a 20-mile radius of the timberline outside Boise. One she remembered most, Amber Chavez, 13, big brown eyes, a bruise on her temple in the intake photo, a chipped tooth. She had screamed when they pulled her out of the truck. Eleanor hadn't been supposed to hear it. She was just a volunteer nurse then, just handing off supplies to a clinic near the border. She hadn't known. But when she saw Amber, when their eyes met across the corridor, everything changed. Eleanor remembered standing in that storage room afterward, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the vial of morphine. It shattered on the tile floor. And then he walked in, Elliot Monroe, tall, sharp-featured, with the calm stillness of a man used to commanding silence. He had been everything she wanted once. Sharp-witted, passionate, full of purpose. He spoke in ideas and dreamed in plans. But in Idaho, he was a different man, a man who had secrets, a man who traded in bodies. You weren't supposed to see her, he said that day. Eleanor hadn't answered. You're going to walk away now. He continued, his voice low, almost apologetic. You're going to forget this. You're going to burn your notes. You're going to transfer out of this goddamn state and never say my name again. She remembered his eyes, not cruel, just certain, like he was stating the weather. And the worst part, she had almost listened, almost. But that night she stole the files. And 2 days later, she went to the police. Only the police weren't enough. The girls vanished again. The cabin burned. Elliot disappeared. And so did any trace of the case. Her reputation never recovered. Unstable, hysterical, conspiracist. Even Robert God, rest him, didn't understand. He tried. He wanted to believe her. But belief without evidence is just love. And love doesn't win in court. She picked up the photo now, the one she had kept hidden even from herself. Elliot Monroe, standing beside a dusty black Jeep, wearing that same look of quiet confidence. Next to him, a younger Eleanor smiling. And, in the background, a barn. The barn. The last place those girls were seen. She stared at his face. Older now, surely. But those eyes, they never aged. They were the same ones she saw in her dreams. The same ones she feared Owen might have inherited if Lena hadn't broken free when she did. And now the voice on the cassette. I know what you did in Idaho. It had to be him. Who else would know? She grabbed the fireplace poker and shoved the rest of the files into the hearth. The Polaroids. The testimonies. Even Amber's name. She lit the match with a shaking hand. The flames rose fast. Paper, especially when it's soaked in guilt, burns hot. But she kept the photo. Just one. Because if this was the beginning of something, if this was a hunt, not a warning, she'd need to remember the prey. Behind her, the wind slapped a branch against the window. Knock, knock, knock. Like knuckles on glass. She jumped. Her heart lurched. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned. Nothing but trees outside, and snow, and black beyond it. But the sound, it was the same. Same as the night before. Same rhythm. Same spot. It hadn't been the wind. It had been him. Watching. Waiting. Marking the house. Marking them. She walked to the window and placed her palm flat against the cold glass. Somewhere out there, Owen was being held. And Shadow. He might already be dead, but the boy still had a chance, because Eleanor Brooks wasn't 28 anymore. She wasn't a volunteer nurse. She wasn't someone with a boss or a uniform or an oath to anyone but herself. She was 70. She was a grandmother, and she had burned too many bridges to ever walk back over them. She turned from the window, walked to the old coat closet, pulled out Robert's hunting jacket. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. She strapped the worn leather belt tight around her waist and reached for the hatchet tucked beneath the boot tray. Not for fighting. Not yet. But because the trail would be deep and the trees were thick and sometimes you needed to cut your way through, she turned off the lights, picked up the photo of Elliot Monroe, and whispered to the darkness, "If you're still out there, you picked the wrong ghost to wake." The sky had turned a pale iron gray by the time Eleanor reached Caleb's cabin, a crooked timber structure tucked beneath a thicket of lodgepole pines. The roof sagged slightly in the center, and the stone chimney leaned like it was tired of standing. Smoke curled lazily from its mouth. He was home. Eleanor stood for a moment in the clearing, one hand clutched tightly around the cassette, the other still holding Robert's old hunting jacket closed at the neck. The trees behind her whispered like old women trading secrets. There were no birds, no wind now. Just stillness. She stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath her weight. Before she could knock, the door creaked open an inch. "You walk heavy today, Miss Brooks," a voice said from inside, gravelly and slow. "Caleb," she breathed. "It's Owen. He's gone." A pause. The door opened fully, revealing the man himself. Caleb Morris stood tall, despite his age, broad-shouldered, in a navy peacoat with the collar turned up. His hair, once copper, had gone nearly white. His eyes, though milky with blindness, turned directly toward her like he saw anyway. He always did. Something about him had never stopped seeing. He stepped aside. "Come in." Inside the cabin, warmth welcomed her, along with the familiar scent of pine tar, old leather, and something bitter, beneath coffee maybe, or ash. The wood stove snapped with fire, casting long shadows on the floorboards. On one wall, a rack of old audio equipment, coiled cords and headphones, hung like surgical tools. On another, a massive corkboard riddled with pinned cassette tapes, handwritten notes and block letters, braille embossings taped at the corners. He gestured toward the armchair beside the stove. "Sit, tell me." She handed him the cassette instead. He turned it over in his hands, reading it like a blind man reads everything with patience. Then he smiled slightly. "Maxell, 1987. Worn. Rewound twice. You can tell that. I can hear it." She told him about the tape, about the voice, about the blood in the snow, about Shadow, about Owen. Caleb didn't interrupt. He just sat the cassette held in both palms, his face calm. But Eleanor could see the war behind his eyes. The way his fingers clenched when she said the word Idaho. The way his mouth pressed tight when she mentioned Elliot Monroe. "I was hoping I'd never hear that name again," Caleb muttered finally. "You knew him." "I knew of him. We all did. Anyone working the lines in the 80s who paid attention." He stood and moved toward his wall of equipment. "I need to hear it again," he said, "but not like you did." From the shelf he pulled a battered machine part cassette player, part reel-to-reel, wired into something homemade. He slid the tape in fingers flying over switches with a precision that only years of blindness could forge. Then he adjusted a dial, inserted a headset into a small slot, and gestured toward the secondary headphone jack. Eleanor put them on. A few moments of static, then the voice. "I know what you did in Idaho, Ellie. You think because it's been 30 years it's gone. But I remember. And Shadow does too. Don't call the cops. You call them, you bury the boy." The tape clicked off, but Caleb didn't move. He rewound, slowed the feed-twisted dials. His ear leaned into the sound like he was tasting it. Then he froze. "There," he whispered. "Where?" she asked. "Listen again," he said. Underneath the voice. Right at the start. He played it again, slower this time. Eleanor strained, and then she heard it. A faint rhythmic clanging. Hollow. Echoing like from stone walls. A bell. Familiar. Caleb nodded as if confirming her thoughts. "That's not just a bell. That's Trinity's bell. I'd stake my life on it." "Trinity Church?" Eleanor asked, eyes wide. "The old stone parish up on Timberline?" "Yeah. And it's been closed since the fire in '92. Bell tower collapsed. They never rebuilt it. But someone's still got that bell." Eleanor's breath caught. "You're sure?" "Sure as sin." He pressed the rewind again. Hear the reverb. That stone echo. Narrow space. Bell rope moving slow. It's not a recorded bell. It's live. Her heart pounded. "It has to be close," Caleb added. "Within a few miles of the original site. Sound doesn't carry further than that, not in this snow. And certainly not in background audio." Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her coat pocket. The photo. Elliot Monroe. Standing near that same bell tower in the background. The last time she ever saw him. "Then we start there," she said. But Caleb wasn't finished. "You said Shadow led you somewhere," once he said. "A place. 7 years ago." "Yes." He wouldn't stop barking one night, which was rare for him. "Led me through the back trails off Clove Ridge. We ended up at a hunting lodge abandoned. Rotted fence, half-collapsed roof. I thought he was just chasing raccoons." "Where was that in relation to Trinity?" Eleanor squinted, calculating. "Maybe 2 miles east. A ridge separates it from the church." Caleb smiled grimly. "Then that's not coincidence." She stood. "We leave now." He raised an eyebrow. "You ready for that?" "I have no other choice." He grabbed his cane, a sleek aluminum rod with a dull wooden handle, and turned toward a cabinet by the door. From it, he pulled a weathered backpack, military grade, and slung it over his shoulder. I keep my boots by the stove, he said. They're warm. She helped him lace them. Neither spoke much. By the time they stepped out into the clearing, dusk was turning the snow lavender. Caleb moved like a man who remembered the forest even without eyes. He let his feet read the earth, let his cane tap gently until it found the trail carved long ago by deer in time. Eleanor walked beside him, her steps cautious but determined. They didn't speak again until they reached the ridge. Ahead, blackened stone pillars rose like broken teeth. Trinity Church had once been grand, Gothic, imposing. Now it looked like the bones of something ancient. Moss grew where stained glass used to live. But Caleb turned away from it. Not there, he said. He lifted his head, nose twitching slightly. There's wood smoke east of here. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The lodge. They cut across the slope. 15 minutes later, they found it, just as she remembered, but changed. There was light inside now. A flickering candle glow barely visible through a cracked board. The fence had been cleared, the door reinforced. Footprints led to and from it. 2 sets. One heavier booted, one small, barefoot. Owen. Eleanor's jaw clenched. Her breath came fast. Stay low, Caleb whispered. Don't speak. They crouched behind a fallen log, watching. Listening. Then movement. Inside the cabin, a figure. Male, broad shoulders. Moving with slow, deliberate weight. Not Owen. The voice from the cassette. Or something worse. Caleb turned toward her, whispering low. You go around the back. Check for a cellar door. These places always have one. I'll listen from the side window. We'll signal each other owl calls. Got it. She nodded. This was no longer about fear. It was about Owen, and the trail finally was warm. The door gave with a long, aching creak, wood swollen with years of snow and silence. Eleanor stepped inside, first flashlight low and chest tight, sweeping across the shadows that folded into each other like dying breaths. Caleb remained just behind her, hand on the doorframe, head tilted to read the air. It was cold, not from the snow outside, but from something abandoned inside. The cabin hadn't seen love in decades, but it had seen something else. Blood. A small trail ran across the warped floorboards, dry, dark, but unmistakable. Smears, not splatters. Like something had been dragged or limped. There were paw prints in it, large ones. Eleanor knelt beside them, her heart falling into the pattern. The pads were wide, heavy, familiar. Shadow. She touched one, still damp in the center. Not old, not gone. Her fingers trembled. He was here, she whispered. She stood, turned her light toward the corner of the room, and froze. A piece of fabric hung on a rusted nail, tattered and limp, like a flag, surrendering in windless air. It was gray. Faint stripes. A child's handkerchief. She stepped closer. 3 letters, hand-stitched in shaky blue thread, stared back at her from the frayed edge. Owen. A sob rose up in her chest like a tidal wave. She bit it down hard. The cloth was torn violently. The top right corner missing entirely. Blood stained the edge. Not much, but enough. She pressed it to her chest, eyes closed. Then Caleb's voice, soft and slow, behind her. Something burned here. She turned. He stood at a makeshift table, once a hunter's prep station, now covered in soot and charcoal dust. At the center lay a map, folded neatly, heavy creases from age. Around it, remnants of a burned envelope. Wax seal barely intact. He didn't touch it. Describe it to me, he said. Eleanor unfolded the map gently, revealing a faded topography of northern Colorado with hand-drawn red circles along a stretch of canyons near the Gunnison River. And at the bottom right corner, barely visible beneath an old military sticker, were words scribbled in a brutal, jagged hand. Ran, 19-2-85. She stared at the word as if it had just hissed out loud. Snake, she muttered. Caleb's face darkened. I haven't heard that name in decades. Eleanor looked up sharply. You know it. He nodded slowly, like the admission itself tasted like ash. Not a name. A code name. Ran. Vietnamese for snake. He wasn't military. Not officially. Mercenary. Slipped between borders in the 70s, worked in Myanmar, Laos, and later Idaho. No government files, just rumors, but brutal ones. She stepped back, her knees almost giving out. Her pulse roared in her ears. Caleb kept speaking, voice as steady as a funeral prayer. He had a partner. Someone younger. A translator at first. Then a disciple. Went by the name Monroe. Eleanor's stomach turned to glass. You're saying Elliot worked with him? He learned from him. They say Rand taught him everything about leverage, silence, and turning love into threat. Her legs buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the table, breathing hard. The room was spinning. Not from altitude, not from cold, from truth. You knew about this, she whispered. All this time, I suspected, Caleb said. Back in Idaho, before everything went black for me. I was on their trail, got too close, got burned. He touched the scar above his ear, barely visible, but permanent. They took more than my eyes. She turned away, eyes wet. This can't be happening. Not again. I buried it. I buried all of it. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out blindly and rested his hand on hers. There's no use burying something that was born in the dark, Ellie. It always finds a way back. She pulled away, shaking. No. No, he's gone. Elliot Monroe is dead. I saw the report. I saw the fire. Did you see a body? She didn't answer. Caleb stepped back, letting the silence speak. Then he asked gently, You ever wonder why Shadow followed you, Eleanor? Out of all those agents, all those people, he only trusted you. She remembered that day. The wreckage of the barn. The stench of rot. And the dog, black as soot, standing in the ruins, watching her like he already knew her pain. He wasn't just a survivor, Caleb said. He was trained. K9, but not standard. Psychological imprinting. Designed to bond with victims. Eleanor sat down hard in the nearest chair. You're saying he was part of the program? Caleb nodded once. He was the program. Outside, the wind shifted. The floor creaked. The cabin seemed to breathe around them, like a beast stirring after years of sleep. Eleanor looked down at the map again. February 19th, 1985, she read aloud. The last known raid, Caleb confirmed. 4 girls rescued. 1 never identified. A woman nurse who vanished right after. He looked at her. She looked away. That was you, wasn't it? Eleanor said nothing. The silence was confirmation enough. The pieces clicked like locks being opened one after another. Shadow had led her here, not by accident, but by design. Someone wanted her to remember. Someone wanted to finish what had started. But why now? Why Owen? She stood and turned toward the fireplace, staring into the blackened ash like it might hold answers. Then faintly, so faintly, she thought she imagined it the sound of a dog's bark. Not far. Wounded. Low. Her eyes snapped open. That's him. Caleb tilted his head. I heard it too, south, maybe 200 yards. They bolted out the door, snow crunching beneath boots, adrenaline chasing fear like fire after smoke. But the past clung to her every step, because this wasn't just about rescue anymore. It was about reckoning. And Shadow, if he was still alive, was leading them straight to it. The signal came as they crossed the low ridge where the trees thinned into a shallow clearing crusted with frost. Caleb was just catching his breath when Eleanor's old flip phone buzzed in her coat pocket, 3 sharp vibrations, then silence. No name, no number, just unknown caller. She stared at it. 1 bar, no service. Her thumb hesitated over the green button, then pressed. The moment the line connected, Eleanor's breath caught. No words, no threats, just a soft sound. A child's voice, humming. The melody was cracked barely above a whisper. But she knew it instantly. Muscle memory tightened in her jaw. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. It was Owen. It wasn't just humming. It was timing a deliberate pace. A rhythm only someone who'd sung that lullaby for 5 years would recognize. Her version always slowed at How I Wonder What You Are, because that was where Owen used to giggle, where his fingers would flutter in the air trying to mimic stars. And then the line went dead. 4 seconds. 4 seconds of eternity. She stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear even after the silence returned. Caleb turned toward her, hearing only her breath. What was it? Owen, she said, voice cracking. He sang to me. The forest swallowed the sound like a secret. Then Caleb spoke low and sure. Then he's close, and he's trying to talk. Eleanor closed her eyes. When Owen lost his voice after the crash, she refused to give up on communication. For 2 years, every afternoon after school, they sat on the living room carpet and played stone games, learning basic shapes, emotions, and names through how he arranged small pebbles. A star meant safe. A circle meant hungry. A triangle meant danger. She opened her eyes. There's a dry creek bed northeast of here, she said suddenly, memory slicing through the fog. That's where we used to go in the summers. Owen called it the Silver River. That's where we learned the stone game. She grabbed Caleb's sleeve. We have to go there. They moved quickly. Caleb's cane tapping forward, Eleanor navigating the uneven terrain with an urgency sharpened by dread. The trees grew thinner, the ground rockier. And then just as the sky began bleeding amber into the clouds, they found it. The creek was dry, as expected, its bed cluttered with pine needles and scattered stones. A fallen log stretched across one edge, now damp with moss. But something stood out. 20 feet ahead, just beneath the curl of a frost-covered boulder, lay an arrangement of stones, delicate, deliberate. 5 pointed rocks arranged into a star. Not random, not natural. Eleanor dropped to her knees. Owen, she whispered. Her hands hovered over the stones as if they were sacred. He's leaving signals, Caleb said behind her, crouching low. He's adapting, finding ways to talk. Eleanor pointed to a small stick laid across one of the star's points. A line, she said. That's how he shows where something happened. She scanned the tree line, trying to trace the direction the stick indicated. Northwest. There's a ranger trail that way, she muttered. Old, overgrown. No one uses it. Caleb tilted his head. If someone wanted to move through this forest unnoticed, that's where they'd go. They started moving. With each step, Eleanor watched the ground, obsessively searching not for footprints, but shapes. The language she had built with Owen wasn't spoken. It lived in patterns, in quiet, in the spaces between fear. 2 minutes later, another signal. A smaller arrangement, 4 stones in a square with a twig broken in half beside them. Eleanor crouched, brushing away leaves. She choked. It means broken room. Caleb furrowed his brow. What's that mean? It was what Owen called the attic, she said. After the fire, he was terrified of going upstairs. He'd make this shape whenever he dreamed about it. 4 corners. Something split inside. They were moving through Owen's dreams now. Every step was a breadcrumb he'd risked everything to leave. 5 more minutes. Then another pattern. This time no stones. Just bark peeled carefully from a tree, revealing a pale heart-shaped mark scratched into the inner wood. Eleanor pressed her palm to it. This is him, she whispered. Behind them, the forest breathed. Birds were gone. No wind. Just silence. Heavy and watching. And then Caleb stopped. I smell iron. Eleanor tensed. Blood. He nodded. They crept forward and found it. Shadow's collar. Caught on a thorn bush, torn and slick with red. Eleanor picked it up with trembling hands. It was still warm. He's not far, she said. He's hurt, but he's close. And then for the first time in hours, a sound tore through the trees. A bark. Sharp, short, then silence again. Caleb gripped her shoulder. That way. They followed the sound through a tangle of deadfall and frostbitten branches until the trees gave way to a clearing Eleanor hadn't seen since she was a girl. A hunting blind, ancient half-rotten stood on stilts at the far end overlooking the valley below. A shadow moved near it, low to the ground, slow. Then it lifted its head. Shadow. He was limping badly, left flank caked in dried blood, eyes glassy. But he saw her, even from 30 feet away. Eleanor dropped to her knees. Shadow, she cried. The dog hesitated, then limped toward her, staggering over roots and through snow. She met him halfway, wrapping her arms around his massive neck as he collapsed into her lap. He whimpered softly, licking her wrist once before laying his head down. Alive, but barely. She whispered over and over, good boy, good boy. Caleb arrived beside her, panting. Was he guarding the blind? Eleanor nodded. They both looked up at the structure. There on the side, scratched into the wood by a small shaking hand. 582 STAR. A code. A signal. Eleanor blinked. That's the old P.O. box, she muttered. From when we used to send Owen letters at school. Caleb smiled slightly. He remembers. They stared at the numbers, the word some part of Eleanor broken and whole all at once. Then her phone buzzed again. One new message. No words, just an image, a single photograph of Owen, standing beside a man whose face was turned away, but whose hand rested heavily on the boy's shoulder. And in the corner of the photo, a date, 2985. The past wasn't behind them anymore. It had caught up, and it was wearing a familiar face. Snow melted beneath Shadow's wounded side as Eleanor wrapped the emergency blanket around him. His eyes, though dulled, tracked her with desperate familiarity, trust baked into their depth like coals buried under ash. They were back at the abandoned hunting blind now, temporary shelter from the wind cutting over the ridge. Eleanor's hands trembled, not from cold but from the surge of memory pressing against her bones like a tide trying to reclaim the shore. Tell me everything, she said quietly. Caleb was kneeling by the fire pit, feeding it broken twigs. He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this moment since before they found Shadow. You remember the Larkridge disappearances, he asked. Eleanor's spine went stiff. You mean Idaho, 1996. 7 children. Caleb continued, vanished in a single year. All from foster homes. All between ages 5 and 7. Only one ever found alive. I know, Eleanor said, voice hoarse. That one was brought to the hospital where I worked. I was his nurse. He never spoke again. Caleb's fingers moved methodically through his coat pocket until he pulled out a creased folder. There was another witness, he said. Not human. He opened the folder. Inside, a black and white photo. A dog. Black German Shepherd. Younger but unmistakable. Cropped ears, tense stance, eyes staring straight at the camera. It was Shadow. They called him K9017, Caleb explained. Part of a joint operation between local PD and a private federal contract unit off-the-book stuff. His handler was embedded in the Larkridge foster system as a social worker. Shadow was trained to detect specific scents, chloroform, ether, ketamine derivatives. Eleanor felt the air thin. She looked at Shadow. Even now, barely able to lift his head, he still twitched when she whispered his name. Still listened. What happened to him? She asked. Caleb's jaw clenched. Official report said he was killed during a failed extraction. But there was no body. Just a collar and a burned vehicle. He looked up. But 2 weeks later, a veterinary tech in Spokane filed a report, said a black dog showed up outside her clinic. Burn marks on the right flank, microchip unreadable. She treated him then. He disappeared again. Eleanor was shaking now. He ran, she said. He escaped, with something Caleb said. Or from someone. They both looked at Shadow. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness. Caleb's voice dropped. I think Shadow saw who ran that operation, and he never forgot. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the truth circled like a wolf. I always thought it was strange, Eleanor murmured. How he found me. Why he stayed. I thought he needed me. He chose you, Caleb said. Because you were there before. You were the last face of mercy in that boy's memory. He followed your scent, your voice, your grief. Eleanor sank to the floor, breath-catching. How much does he remember? Caleb pulled a small recorder from his coat. Attached a black microphone unusually thick. It's not memory, he said. It's reflex. He pressed a button. A soft growl played through the speaker, followed by a sharp, clipped bark. Shadow's ears lifted. Barely. But they moved. Years ago, Caleb continued. I helped develop a prototype soundboard for retired canines with PTSD. We recorded and categorized their vocal responses to stimuli, pain alarm, fear threat, narcotics, chemicals. He fiddled with the dial. Another bark. This one different. Shorter, higher pitched, repetitive. Shadow let out a faint whine. His paw twitched. That one Caleb said he only made when exposed to a chemical compound called hexacol. It's a rare paralytic. Fast-acting, undetectable without specialized equipment. Was being tested in black labs in the early 90s. Eleanor stiffened. That's what they used on the kids. Caleb nodded. And Shadow remembers the smell. His brain retained the pattern. Even if his body can't chase anymore, his instincts are still cataloging everything. Eleanor moved beside the dog, cupping his head in her hands. You've been trying to warn me, she whispered. All this time. Shadow's tail thumped weakly once. Then Eleanor said it out loud, like pulling a splinter from her chest. I think he knows where Owen is. Caleb looked at her, then reached into his backpack. He pulled out a small case inside a digital analysis tool wired to the recorder. If we find a trace of hexacol anywhere near Owen's trail, Shadow will react. We can use his reactions to triangulate, like sonar, except with scent. Except, Eleanor blinked. So you're saying? I'm saying he's not just a dog, Caleb replied. He's a tracker. Even now. Even broken. Outside, the clouds began to darken, threatening a new storm. But inside, something ignited. Purpose. Eleanor kissed the top of Shadow's head. You're not done yet, old boy. A low hum vibrated from his chest. Not a bark, not a growl, but something deeper. A warning. Then Eleanor stood fire in her voice. Then we go to the source. We follow the scent. We find the place they're holding Owen. Caleb nodded. One of the only ways to process hexacol in open air is through filtration units. Industrial ones. That means power. That means traceable noise. He tapped the recorder again, switching to another frequency. This one amplifies ambient, low-frequency hum. Could pick up generators, compressors, anything running underground. Eleanor gripped her coat. Then we start walking. He'll lead us. And as she stepped out into the biting cold once more, Shadow stirred behind her, limbs shaking, breath shallow. But he rose, because even ghosts obey one command: protect the child. The ground beneath their boots shifted with the weight of something buried. The trees had long stopped whispering. Now they stood frozen, brittle silhouettes against a steel-gray sky. Shadow limped ahead, one paw dragging slightly in the dirt, but his nose was alert, pulling them toward a thicket of collapsed pine. They had veered off the path 20 minutes earlier when his shadow began growling not toward anything visible, but toward earth itself. Eleanor brushed aside moss and damp leaves with gloved fingers, uncovering a rusted hatch half swallowed by roots and time. It wasn't marked, but the soil around it was disturbed. Caleb crouched beside her, running his hand along the surface. This wasn't here by accident. Eleanor found the latch. It squealed as she forced it open. A waft of stale air hit them, metallic laced with ammonia and something older. Shadow growled again, lower this time. Not warning, not fear. Recognition. The stairs descended into darkness, slick and narrow. Eleanor flicked on the flashlight. Caleb followed, tapping carefully with his cane. The walls were concrete, old military grade, still lined with rusting pipes and frostbitten chains. Faint carvings scratched into the paint, most illegible, until they reached the base. Scrawled across the wall in crude black soot, "No one escapes if Shadow lives." The words dragged across Eleanor's spine like ice. She stepped closer. The letters weren't just written, they were clawed into the surface. The pressure, the depth. This wasn't graffiti. It was a promise, a threat. Caleb touched the edge of one letter. They feared him. Eleanor didn't reply. Her gaze had drifted downward. There at the foot of the wall rested something out of place. Small, bright. A child's toy flag, wooden, painted red, white, and blue. The stick cracked at the base. She bent down, cradling it in her hand like glass. "Owen made this," she whispered, "for Memorial Day. Said it was for Daddy." She closed her eyes, fighting the quake rising in her throat. He wouldn't have left it behind. Caleb said nothing, but his face shifted, his brows, low, jaw firm. Then he turned toward the far wall. The air was denser here. The temperature dropped. He tapped the concrete. "Hollow." "There's more behind this," he said. "A second chamber." They moved quickly. Caleb found a rusted seam in the corner, what had once been a sliding panel. Shadow pressed his nose to it, whined, and then a sound, a faint scrape. From the other side, someone was in there. Eleanor stepped back, her breath hitching. "Is it Owen?" Caleb leaned in, listening. The sound came again. A drag, a shift, like someone moving across stone with cloth-wrapped limbs. They both froze as something tapped 3 quick knocks from inside the wall. Then silence. Eleanor turned to Shadow. "Is it him?" she asked softly. The dog stepped forward, placing his paw against the panel. Then he growled, but not in fear, in recognition. Caleb exhaled sharply. "I don't think this is just instinct anymore," he said. "There's memory in him. Patterns, names." Eleanor frowned. "You mean like trauma?" "No," Caleb said. "I mean training. This dog wasn't just used to detect. He was embedded." He stood staring at Shadow. "I think they used him to infiltrate." Over and over. He was passed from one ring to the next, to gather scent signatures, behavioral mapping. He turned to Eleanor. "You ever wonder how Shadow found you out of everyone?" Eleanor blinked. "I thought he recognized me from the hospital." Caleb shook his head. "I think he was sent to find you. Or he ran from them and found the one person who knew the truth they buried. You were the last survivor of that Idaho unit." Eleanor backed away, clutching the wooden flag. "No, that's not possible." But Shadow stood still, staring into the wall, not barking, not whining, waiting, like he'd been here before, like he remembered. Caleb knelt beside him. "You were a ghost they couldn't kill," he whispered. "A living curse." And Shadow's tail thumped once, not joy, not relief. Affirmation. Eleanor stepped closer to the wall, resting her hand against the concrete. "Then what's behind this?" Caleb listened again. No more tapping. Just silence. But it wasn't empty. It watched. Then he said, voice grave, "If they kept him alive after all these years, it means there's still someone. Still something worth hiding." Eleanor turned the toy flag in her hands. "This place, this bunker, it was a holding site for transfers." Caleb nodded. "Or punishments." Suddenly Shadow barked. Once, sharp, toward the left wall. They turned. A vent grate, bent. Eleanor rushed over, peered through, and her heart stopped. A child's shoe, wedged against the grating. Tiny, blue, torn. Owen. She grabbed the grate, tried to pull, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me!" Caleb wedged his crowbar into the edge, and with a grunt, the metal shrieked open. A narrow crawl space stretched beyond too small for an adult, maybe even for a child. But Shadow stepped forward again, sniffed the air, and growled. Then behind them, a light flickered. No emotion sensor. Something still had power. Eleanor whipped around. "This place isn't abandoned." The moment she said it, the door behind them slammed shut. A hiss filled the air. Gas. No smell. Just cold. Caleb staggered toward the door. "We triggered something." Eleanor grabbed Shadow, dragged him back toward the crawl space. "Shadow, go. Find Owen." But the dog didn't move. He just looked at her. Caleb's eyes widened. He's waiting for permission. He was trained never to leave the handler's line of sight without a command. Eleanor stared into those eyes. Black, steady, not animal. "Not anymore." "Go," she said. Shadow blinked and ran. Into the vent. Gone. Eleanor turned back to Caleb, eyes watering from the rising gas. "We have 5 minutes." He nodded, moving toward the panel again. "There's a manual release somewhere." They searched in silence. Panic scratched at the edge of their lungs. Then, a click. The door unlatched. Air rushed in. They staggered outside, coughing, dragging themselves into the snow. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, gasping. Then she heard it. A sound rising from below. A bark. Twice. Sharp. Then silence. Shadow had found something. The cold hadn't left her bones. Snow clung to Eleanor's coat, her fingers numb as she gripped the edge of the bunker's opening and hauled herself free. Caleb collapsed beside her chest, heaving. The sudden rush of air had saved them, but whatever system triggered that gas release wasn't meant to warn. It was meant to end. The forest stood still around them. Even the birds seemed to vanish. Only the wind dared to whisper. Shadow hadn't returned. "Owen?" Eleanor whispered, eyes searching the dark horizon. "Please hold on." Caleb staggered to his feet, fumbling with his equipment. "I'm going to try to ping Shadow's collar. He may have passed through to another vent exit." Eleanor nodded, trying to steady her breath. Her heart thumped in her ears. She took a step, then froze. A branch snapped behind her. Caleb's head lifted too late. Something struck the back of Eleanor's neck. She crumpled. Darkness swallowed her. She came to with the unmistakable sting of cold metal on her wrists. Tied, chair, wooden, old. A dim room, dusty, smelled of wet earth and rotting insulation. And then footsteps, confident, slow. A man emerged from the shadows. Tall, lean, gray stubble, leather gloves. The same slate-blue eyes she remembered, eyes that once looked at her like she was the only living thing worth saving. "Hello, Ellie." Her voice caught in her throat. "Elliot," she whispered. "You're dead." He smiled. "Not quite. Though you left me for dead, didn't you?" She flinched. "I thought you were gone in the fire." "Oh, I was in the fire. I started it." He stepped closer, circling her like a vulture. "I lit the charges myself. Back in that Idaho orphanage. We were supposed to erase the evidence. Remember, clean sweep." Eleanor's pulse thundered. "You were in that ring. You were one of them." He didn't deny it. "I was their collector, their courier, their cleaner. And you were the nurse who turned." He crouched to eye level. "I remember the look on your face when you saw the boy with the bruised ribs. You stopped being one of us that day." "I was never one of you," Eleanor spat. He chuckled. "You were in deep, darling. You knew more than you admit, even to yourself. You think they let you into that hospital rotation by chance." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't understand. But you do now," he said. He stood again, pulling something from his coat. A cassette recorder. He pressed play. Her own voice echoed back, recorded decades ago, pleading, crying. "I don't want to do this anymore. I'll get the boy out. You owe me." Elliot clicked it off. "You see, even then you thought you could walk away. But no one walks away. Not really." He moved behind her. "Which brings us to today. To Owen." Her chest constricted. "Where is he?" "Safe," Elliot said. "For now." He walked around again, pulled up a second chair, and sat across from her. "You know why I took him?" Eleanor didn't answer. "Because you owe me," he said, voice low. "You ran. You let me burn while you built this sweet little life in Colorado. You let that thing follow you, your black shadow, with its war-torn eyes." He leaned in. "That dog, it remembers." She blinked. "You're afraid of him." "Not afraid," Elliot whispered. "Cursed. You think it was just another dog that wandered into your life? Shadow was trained with me. He was mine. Until the fire." He smiled. "Now he won't die. Believe me, I've tried. Shot, poisoned, burned. Nothing works." He stood, voice rising with fury barely restrained. He saw everything. He remembers everything. He won't stop. Not until I'm gone. And not even death will stop him if he's still breathing. Eleanor's voice shook. "Then let him find you." Elliot pulled a knife. "You still don't get it. Shadow is the knife." He raised the blade to her neck, not pressing, just resting. A threat made of silence. They built him to track and kill. But not by fangs. By memory, by association. You're the last thing tying him to the old world, to the guilt. If you die, maybe he'll finally rest. She stared at him. "I won't give you that peace." He stepped back, rage flickering. "You won't have a choice." Then a noise, subtle, outside. A low, guttural growl. Elliot turned sharply. "No," he whispered. The lights in the cabin flickered. The wind rose, shaking the wooden walls, like they were made of paper. Then glass shattered. Shadow burst through the side window, his body a streak of black fire. The force of his leap sent Elliot sprawling to the floor. Eleanor screamed. Shadow didn't bark. He lunged, not for the throat, for the hand, the one holding the knife. It clattered to the floor. Elliot cried out, scrambling back, his coat torn. He followed me again. Shadow stood between them, chest heaving, legs braced. His eyes didn't blink. Elliot grabbed the knife, but before he could rise, a second figure entered. "Caleb," gun in hand, pointed straight at Elliot's chest. "Move," Caleb said, "and I'll let the dog finish you." Elliot froze. The room pulsed with the sound of heavy breathing and fate. Eleanor's voice cracked. "Where is Owen?" Elliot's lips curled. "He's here, beneath the floor." Caleb fired a warning shot into the floorboards, an inch from Elliot's foot. Wrong answer. Elliot's shoulders sank. He gestured toward a trap door beneath the rug. Caleb kicked it open, a narrow crawl space. And inside, Owen, Eleanor cried, struggling against her restraints. The boy blinked up at the light, trembling, but alive. Caleb helped him out, carrying him to Eleanor. Elliot made one last move, but Shadow was faster. He tackled him into the wall jaws, snapping not to kill, but to pin. To mark. Elliot stopped fighting. He slumped, beaten not by force, but by memory. Caleb tied his wrists. Shadow stepped back. The room fell still again. And Eleanor, holding Owen in her arms, looked up at her old lover, the man who once saved her life, only to haunt it. "You were right," she said. "I do owe you." She leaned in, whispered in his ear, "But not a life." She nodded toward Shadow. "I owed you justice." The wind howled like a wounded ghost across the frozen pines, tearing at Eleanor's coat as she gripped Owen tight against her chest. his cheek pressed against her collarbone, his breath shallow but steady. Caleb walked beside her, his steps steady despite the ice, a flashlight strapped to his chest, his hands clutching the old revolver he hadn't used in years. Shadow was ahead of them, limping, yes, but unstoppable. Blood bloomed dark across the snow in droplets behind him, soaking his flank. He didn't whimper. He didn't pause. Every inch of his body radiated determination, a silent oath to finish what had begun years ago. Eleanor glanced down at the map Owen had drawn in crayon on parchment, an old geological chart he'd found inside the cabin's wall. But the drawings weren't random arrows, stars, little stick figures, and X's marked vents, stairs, tunnels. He must have memorized the layout, Caleb muttered. This is more than a child's drawing. They reached the ridge. Below them, the tree line opened into a clearing coated in ice and moonlight. And there it stood, half buried in the earth like a forgotten relic from a war no one spoke about anymore, the underground training facility. Gray cement, barbed wire, silent floodlights. A chain-link gate locked shut with rusted steel. Eleanor's voice was ice. That's where they kept them, Caleb nodded grimly. And where they made them forget who they were. Shadow stopped at the gate. Then, without sound, he veered left, vanishing behind the collapsed perimeter fence. Eleanor and Caleb followed, stepping carefully through the knee-deep snow, until they reached the side wall, where a portion had caved in, just large enough for a dog to wriggle through. Ready, Caleb asked. Eleanor looked at Owen, eyes wide, but calm. He nodded once. I was born ready the moment he took him, she said. They slipped inside. Darkness swallowed them whole. Inside, the air was warm. Wrong. Artificial heat radiated from floor vents. The walls were windowless, coated in gray-green paint peeled and faded. Faint sounds echoed dripping water, the buzz of old electricity, the rattle of something moving down the hall. Shadow was waiting, his fur slicked back with blood eyes glowing faintly under the emergency lighting. He turned down a corridor, and they followed. They passed empty cells, some with crayon drawings on the walls, others with claw marks. What is this place? Caleb whispered. A memory prison, Eleanor said. They broke children down, taught them to forget who they were, then built new identities to be sold. Caleb's jaw clenched, like Owen. Shadow stopped at a steel door marked B2. He growled. Not at the door, at what was behind it. Eleanor pressed her ear to the cold metal. Muffled voices. Two men, arguing. They said, kill the woman, bury the dog. What about the boy? He's leverage. Elliot's orders. Then a click, a mechanical hum. They're destroying the files, Eleanor whispered. Everything we need to shut this down. Caleb raised the revolver. Not if we stop them first. Eleanor placed Owen gently into a corner, shielding him behind a utility cabinet. She kissed his forehead. You stay here. No matter what happens, don't move. Owen nodded, silent, brave. She stood beside Caleb. He kicked the door open. It flew back with a thunderous crack and chaos erupted. Inside, two men turned, guns drawn. Eleanor ducked behind a support pillar as a shot shattered the wall near her head. Caleb fired back once, twice. One of the men stumbled, clutching his shoulder. The second raised his weapon only to be taken down by a streak of black fur in fury. Shadow leapt through the air and latched onto the man's wrist, dragging him down. The gun clattered away. The man screamed, but Shadow didn't release. He pinned him, jaws locked, until Eleanor grabbed the weapon and aimed. Move, she whispered to Shadow. He obeyed. One shot. Silence. The facility echoed with the single report of justice. The man with the wounded shoulder groaned, trying to crawl toward the computer terminal. His hand outstretched toward a blinking red button marked Purge. Eleanor stepped on his hand. Don't. He spat blood. It's too late. Elliot's on his way. Caleb's voice was like gravel. Then let him come. They tied the man to a desk, retrieved the backup drive from the terminal, and gathered whatever documents hadn't been shredded. Eleanor turned to Shadow. Where now? He growled low, then took off down the next corridor. They passed training rooms. Beds bolted to floors. Whiteboards with names and numbers and fake birthdays. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Then a voice. Elliot. You always bring hell with you, Ellie. She turned. He stood at the far end of the corridor, blood at his temple, gun in hand, flanked by a mercenary with a rifle. Put the files down, Elliot said. No, she replied. Then I'll bury all of you down here, he growled. Just like I buried the last witnesses, Shadow growled. The mercenary aimed at him, but Shadow was already moving. He lunged faster than the man could fire. Eleanor fired her weapon as chaos exploded once again. The mercenary dropped, shoulder-torn open rifle, skidding across the floor. Elliot charged forward, tackling Caleb to the ground. They wrestled, fists flying. Caleb elbowed him in the ribs, but Elliot landed a punch that cracked bone. Eleanor moved to help, but Elliot turned pistol in hand. Don't, he warned. Eleanor froze. Elliot dragged Caleb to his knees, gun at his temple. You give me the boy, he hissed, or I end him. Then do it, Caleb rasped. but you'll never leave alive. Elliot's hand trembled, then a whisper, "Twinkle, twinkle." His head turned. Owen, standing in the hallway's end, alone. Elliot smiled. "There's my boy." He stepped forward, and that's when Shadow struck. Not from the front, from above. The ceiling duct exploded with claws and fury as Shadow dropped like a shadowy comet, latching onto Elliot's arm. The gun fired. "Missed," Elliot screamed. Shadow tore into his shoulder, this time not for warning. This time to end it. The gun dropped. Eleanor ran, scooped it up, and aimed. "Don't kill him," Caleb gasped. "We need him alive." But Elliot was already fading. Blood pooled beneath him. His breath gurgled. He looked up at Eleanor. "I saved you." She stared. "You used me." He coughed, laughing bitterly. "I never knew you had it in you." Shadow growled again. And Elliot finally went still. They stood there for a moment, panting. The corridor smelled of copper and dust. Then, a sound. From deeper in the facility, a door creaked, and a voice young, tentative. "Hello." Eleanor turned. From a dark hallway, a line of children emerged, thin, silent, barefoot, eyes wide. They had heard the fight, and they had waited. Caleb staggered to his feet. Shadow limped to Eleanor's side, bleeding still but tail wagging. She knelt, and for the first time in decades, she cried, not from fear, but from release. The nightmare was ending. In snow, in silence, with fire in their veins, and family in their arms. But it wasn't over yet. They still had to get them out. The hallway was dead silent, except for the dripping of blood and the soft metallic groan of old pipes expanding against the cold. Eleanor moved slowly, her breath shallow, her hands still shaking from the last shot she fired. Beside her, Caleb winced with every step, the bruises on his ribs darkening beneath his coat. Shadow limped ahead of them, more blood than fur now, but eyes sharp, teeth gritted against the pain. They hadn't found Owen yet. Not in the cells, not in the back room where the children had been kept, not in the computer lab where Elliot had burned files to cover up decades of horror. They followed the childlike drawings left behind, chalk outlines of stars and paws and the faint shape of a house. Owen's silent handwriting. And then they saw it. A thin veil of fog clung to the end of a corridor. Beyond it, a locked glass door sealed from the outside. Inside, standing barefoot in a small sterile room, was Owen. He stood on his tiptoes, drawing with his finger on the moisture-clouded glass. A shape, a long snout, 4 legs, a tail. Shadow. Eleanor pressed her hand to the glass. "Owen." He looked up, eyes full of relief, of pain, of trust. Then, behind her, a click. Cold steel pressed to her neck. "Move," a voice said. "Elliot." She hadn't killed him. He was bleeding, hunched, limping, but alive. A gun in one hand, a detonator in the other. "I always knew you'd find him," he said through gritted teeth. "Because you're just that predictable." Caleb raised his hands slowly. "Don't do this," Elliot sneered. "I gave you everything, Eleanor. A second chance. A life. I buried that past for you." "You buried children," Eleanor snapped. He grabbed her arm. "Don't pretend you weren't part of it. I never knew. But you looked away." Shadow growled low and deep, positioning himself between Elliot and Owen's door. Elliot pressed the gun into Eleanor's ribs. "Here's your choice. You open that door and save the boy. Or you send your mangy dog to stop me and watch the glass room fill with gas." Eleanor's heart stopped. "You wouldn't?" He showed the small remote. "One press. It's already rigged." "I always prepare for loyalty problems." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "Owen's just a boy." "He's a legacy," Elliot hissed. "And I'm not dying alone." Caleb took a step forward. Elliot aimed the gun at him. "Don't." Shadow tensed. Elliot noticed. "You want to play hero, mutt?" He sneered. "Come on then. One more trick." The dog didn't wait. Shadow lunged straight into the air, straight into the bullet. The shot thundered in the corridor. Blood sprayed across the wall. Shadow hit the ground hard, but didn't stop. He bit down on Elliot's arm, the one holding the detonator. Elliot screamed, dropping the device. Eleanor dove, snatching it off the floor. Caleb tackled Elliot from behind, slamming him against the wall. But Elliot was still strong desperation, lending him power. He elbowed Caleb, knocking the wind from him, then scrambled toward the glass room. He reached for the lock override and stopped. The cold barrel of Eleanor's gun pressed against his forehead. Shadow lay behind her, panting, barely breathing. "Do it," Elliot snarled. "I know you want to." "I don't want to," Eleanor whispered. "I have to." She pulled the trigger. Elliot dropped, this time for good. The silence that followed was absolute. Caleb pushed himself to his feet, gasping. "Get the boy." Eleanor punched in the override code. The glass door slid open. Owen stepped out, blinking into her arms, his face buried in her neck. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. She felt every word in the way he clung to her. And then she knelt beside Shadow. He was breathing barely. A pool of red soaked into the floor beneath him. His side was torn, his leg trembling. But his eyes stayed locked on hers. "Stay with me," she whispered. He blinked once. Then again, she laid her hand on his chest. "You brought him back. You brought me back." Caleb came beside her. "We need to move. There could be more." But Eleanor didn't hear him. She was remembering the day she first found Shadow bloodied, limping beneath a bridge in Idaho. He had looked at her then the same way he did now, not like a dog, like a soul who had seen the same darkness, and chosen to walk her home. Owen crawled beside them, placing his tiny hand on Shadow's paw. He whispered not a sound but a breath. "Thank you." The snow had melted weeks ago, but the chill in Eleanor's bones remained. Spring came slow to the Colorado Highlands that year, as if even the earth wasn't ready to start over. The tri-yam had burned to the ground 2 days after the raid. Some said it was sabotage. Others claimed it was mercy. FBI agents swept in with cameras, drones, reporters in tow. The local news wanted faces. They wanted tears. But Eleanor Brooks never gave them a soundbite. She stood behind the caution tape wrapped in Caleb's old fire jacket, her face still smeared with soot, her eyes too tired to glare. When asked for comment, she said nothing. She'd said enough for a lifetime. They offered her protection, relocation, testimony. She declined all three. What she accepted instead was the silence. The days bled into one another, as soft and pale as cotton cloths left to dry. Caleb came by once a week, twice, if the mail was heavy, and left groceries on the front porch. He rarely knocked. He knew better. They had both survived something that didn't deserve words. Sometimes they sat in the sun, sharing silence and hot tea, watching Owen in shadow. Owen no longer wandered far. He liked the front yard, the porch, the window seat. He still didn't speak, but he made sounds now. Little hums, vibrations in his throat, echoes of old lullabies Eleanor used to sing him at bedtime. She would hear him whisper the shape of a song, never the lyrics, just the ghost of rhythm and breath. The therapists called it progress. Eleanor called it memory. And memory, like grief, had no deadline. Shadow lay in the same spot every day, beneath the bay window, head resting on his good leg, the other one tucked awkwardly behind him. His eyes, once sharp as frost, had faded to a milky blue. The vet said he was blind now, that shrapnel had grazed his optic nerve, that he would never chase a sound again. He didn't whimper, not once. He only growled when someone came too close. The mailman, a passing cyclist, the hum of delivery trucks on the road. They triggered something in him, something old, something earned, but not with Owen. With Owen, Shadow still wagged his tail, still lifted his head when the boy approached, still leaned his weight into that small hand as it pressed gently to his chest, just over the heart. Every morning, like clockwork, Owen would rise before Eleanor pad barefoot across the creaky floorboards and kneel beside Shadow. He'd place his hand where the fur had grown back coarse over the bullet wound and just hold it there. 10 minutes, sometimes longer. He never missed a morning. And when Eleanor would ask softly, "What are you saying to him, love?" Owen would only blink, and then go back to drawing. He liked chalk now. The front walk was covered in strange shapes, spirals, dots, stars. A paw print traced in perfect symmetry, the outline of a woman's face. A boy's handprint next to it. A symbol she recognized from the old Idaho files, the infinity knot. Sometimes Eleanor thought he was trying to write, to speak through art, what his mouth still couldn't form. But sometimes she wondered if he was listening. Not to her, not to the world, but to the heartbeat under his hand. It was late one Sunday when the knock came. Eleanor didn't answer. Caleb did. He stepped onto the porch, spoke low with the woman in black. Someone from the bureau, no doubt. She had a folder under her arm. She left it behind. Eleanor opened it at the kitchen table. Inside, photographs, transcripts, a medal. Posthumous commendation for Shadow K-9 Special Service, formerly declared MIA, now restored. There were old documents, too. Pages unsealed from the Idaho case, names crossed out, locations redacted. But one name remained in bold, Shadow. He had once been property of the government. Then a ghost. Then a fugitive. Now, at last, a hero. She folded the file and left it in the drawer under the toaster. Never looked at it again. One evening, the sky went lavender at dusk. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and sat in the old chair by the window. The same one she used to read in before bed. Before the letters came. Before the cassette. Before blood stained the snow. Shadow lay at her feet. Owen sat by his side, one small hand still resting on his chest, as if to remind them both, "I'm still here." "Do you remember this?" she whispered. Shadow didn't lift his head, but his ear twitched. She smiled. 7 years ago, you sat right there. I thought you were a stray." The memory returned like a whisper. The dog, half-starved, coated in ash, refusing to leave the porch, even when she brought out food and left it by the step. Sitting there day after day, until one morning she woke to find him curled beside her door, guarding the silence like a sentinel. "I thought I saved you," she said, "but I think it was the other way around." Outside, the wind rustled the pine trees. Their branches swayed like arms in mourning, or maybe dancing. She wasn't sure anymore. The world had taken on a different rhythm since that night in the bunker. Nothing was the same, but nothing was gone either. Owen suddenly stood. He walked to the door, opened it without fear, and stepped into the dying light. Shadow impossibly rose, too. He followed, not with grace, not with speed, but with intention, one limp, one breath at a time. Eleanor watched them disappear into the long golden grass. Her hand fell to her lap, fingers twitching slightly. They'll be okay, she told herself, and for the first time in a long while. She believed it. The new house wasn't much, just a one-story wooden cabin tucked beneath the mountain's shoulder, where the wind moved like breath through the trees and the sky always looked half asleep. But to Eleanor, it felt like breathing room. A place untouched by the echoes of glass cells and blood-stained snow. A place where silence could be something other than punishment. It had taken Caleb 3 weekends and 2 borrowed trucks to help them move. He never complained, never asked why they were leaving the old house. He just nodded when Eleanor handed him the keys and said, "This place will remember peace, I think." They unpacked slowly. The essentials came first. Owen's notebooks, the quilt Eleanor had sewn the winter after her husband died. Shadow's mat, though. Shadow rarely used it now. He preferred the dirt, the shade, the sun-warmed wood of the porch. They didn't need much else. Every morning, Owen walked the new forest trails with Eleanor. He carried a small leather pouch she had stitched for him. Inside were dozens of flat stones, each painted by hand with a white star. Whenever Shadow stopped walking, Owen would dig gently into the soft soil at the foot of the nearest tree and leave one of the stones behind. He never said why, but Eleanor knew he was marking memory, and memory was sacred. Shadow had slowed in the past week. His limp worsened. His breathing grew shallower in the evenings. He didn't howl anymore, not even in his sleep. He simply lay still, eyes half open, always alert, even as the world blurred around him. Eleanor pretended not to notice. She still put water in the bowl each morning. Still placed 1 egg beside it, like she always had, since that first winter, his favorite. She didn't cry. Not when he stopped eating. Not when he refused the medicine. Not when he stopped following Owen past the clearing. He knows, Caleb said one night. They stood on the porch, mugs in hand, watching the stars blink open, one by one. He's waiting. For what? Caleb looked out into the dark. For the right morning. That morning came colder than expected. Snow had fallen in the night, quiet, heavy, like an apology from the sky. The air smelled like cedar and frost. Eleanor woke early. Owen was already outside, bundled in his red coat, standing next to Shadow, who lay in the middle of the clearing where the forest path began. The boy looked up at her. His eyes weren't afraid. Eleanor stepped out barefoot, the cold biting into her heels, but she didn't stop. Shadow lifted his head as she knelt beside him. His ears perked toward the wind. Then he stood, not gracefully, not without effort, but he stood, facing east toward the rising sun, toward the edge of the trees. He raised his head, nose catching the air. For a moment he was still, then his body softened. He lay down again, and didn't move. No breath, no sound, just peace. Owen didn't cry. He knelt beside the dog, one hand on his side, the other reaching into his pouch. He placed 1 final stone painted silver, not white, into the snow beside Shadow's paw, and then he began to draw. The drawing took him 3 days. He used the side of the cabin as his canvas, slats of wood smoothed by Eleanor's hand and Caleb's sanding tool. Paints from the art store in town, and no help. He didn't speak during those days, but his hands never stopped moving. When he was done, Eleanor stood beside him, breath caught in her throat. The mural showed a snowy field. In it, a small boy walked barefoot across the frozen ground. His hand reached out, not to another person, but to a dog, jet black glowing faintly in the winter light. They were walking together toward a trail of stars. Each star was a stone, each stone a memory. And at the bottom of the mural, in shaky, careful lettering, Owen had painted 4 words, Shadow in the Last Road. Eleanor touched the letters with her fingers. They trembled beneath her skin. Winter passed, then spring. Owen began to speak, not all at once, but in fragments. A word at a time, then a sentence. Always soft, always near Eleanor's ear. He didn't like loudness, but he liked poetry. Sometimes he recited the names of trees. Sometimes he whispered songs into Caleb's old cassette recorder. Sometimes he simply said Shadow would have liked that and smile. The first time he said it, Eleanor broke down, but not from grief, from gratitude. One evening, months later, she sat by the mural and watched the sky bleed orange over the ridge. Owen was inside writing something with colored pencils. Caleb was making tea. The wind picked up soft and warm. It carried with it the scent of pine, of smoke, and something else. Fur. She looked toward the forest trail. Of course no one was there, but she felt it, the weight of a head against her knee, the thud of a tail on the porch, the breath of something loyal and tired and still watching. "Thank you," she whispered. No answer came. None was needed. The last light fell behind the mountain, and somewhere beyond trees and beyond stars, a black dog ran again. Free, whole, forever. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. Handwritten, no return address. Only the shaky script of a girl named Mia, 12 years old, from Montana. Dear Miss Eleanor, I heard what you did. I'm not good with people. I don't like closed spaces. But my mom showed me your interview. She says you're not afraid of monsters. I want to be like that one day. Also, I had a dog too. Eleanor read it twice, then folded it into a wooden box on her kitchen shelf. By Friday, there were 6 more. One from Michigan, another from Maine, California, Oregon. All different stories. Same shadows, same silence. And then Eleanor knew what she had to do. She called it The Last Companion. It began as a modest program, a quiet name. No press, no television interviews. Just her Caleb and a retired trauma therapist who used to work with military dogs. The idea was simple pair children who had survived abduction trafficking or long-term confinement with dogs that had been trained but abandoned. Dogs who, like Shadow, had once served, once fought, and once been forgotten. The children were usually silent. The dogs never asked questions. And somehow healing started there. The foundation grew fast, not because it was flashy, but because it worked. The word spread in quiet circles. Families, shelters, survivor forums. Eleanor never sought publicity, but one photograph, a boy kneeling beside a German shepherd, his fingers brushing the dog's scarred snout, went viral. Donations came pouring in, but Eleanor didn't expand recklessly. She kept the cabin, kept her porch, kept the mural Owen had painted of Shadow and the star-stone path. She said no to more than she said yes, because The Last Companion wasn't about saving everyone. It was about saving the ones who still believed they couldn't be saved. Owen rarely spoke still. His voice had returned, but he held it like something fragile. Something you only offer when the moment asks for it, not when the room demands it. He smiled more now. He drew constantly animals' forests, people with no mouths but bright eyes. He liked making tea with Caleb. He liked feeding the dogs, but he never asked for another dog of his own. Until one morning during a group therapy circle, the therapist asked a simple question. What makes you feel safe? Children hesitated. One said, when the lights are on. Another said, when someone knocks before coming in. And then Owen, barely above a whisper, said, Shadow, still here. Everyone turned. Eleanor felt something crack open in her ribs. Caleb wiped a tear from his blind eye. No one said a word for a long time. They didn't need to. Caleb, for his part, had taken on an entirely new mission. He'd begun leading orientation hikes for the visually impaired. Nothing ambitious, gentle walks through the low trails, guided by scent, sound, and memory. You don't need eyes to navigate the world, he'd say, tapping his walking stick. You just need something worth walking toward. He was working on a book, audio only. Tentative title, Where Dogs Go When They're Done Saving Us. He never shared the manuscript. But Eleanor once caught him speaking softly to the recorder right before sunrise. Shadow, if you're listening, thank you for making me feel brave again. That winter, Eleanor bought a chisel. She carried it up the hill behind their home, past the last curve of trail, where Shadow used to pause, where Owen had once placed the final silver starstone. It took her 3 days, hands numb, eyes wet. But when she finished, there stood a wooden post, tall and honest, with a plaque carved deep and clear. Some souls guard you even after they're gone. They held a small ceremony. No speeches, no music. Just Eleanor, Caleb, and Owen standing quietly beneath the falling snow. Owen placed a single stone at the base of the plaque, one he had painted black, with a single golden line running through the middle. Shadow's road, he whispered. Caleb smiled. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, her heart didn't feel like a haunted house. It felt like a door left open for light. The video faded to white. Then came one final frame, a silhouette of a dog running across a snowy hilltop. No leash, no master, just wind and freedom. Below it in handwriting traced from Owen's mural, good boys never really leave.